Hello and welcome to the Brazilian BA guest. We have here almost every week a different guest talking about something that's interesting for business analysts. And today I have a special guest who already was here once, who was very influenced, a very important influencer in the business analysis area, someone who defined a lot of important concepts in software engineering. This guest is my friend Karl Wiegers. Hello, Karl. Thank you for coming again.
Hello, Fabricio. It's great to see you again. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Karl, I have a good question for you today. My question is, what is the most important lesson you've learned about software development in the past 50 years?
And that's 50 years. That's a long time. Yeah, I first learned to program in college 51 years ago. Fortran, of course.
Fortran.
Yes. And it seems
very useful today, is it?
Well, I don't know. It's I don't know how much it's still used. I have a friend who still does a whole lot of COBOL work. So
COBOL, yes, I know.
Some of these old languages.
You probably are not programming Fortran anymore, are you?
No. But, back then that was the thing we learned. So that was a very common way to first get into programming. And it was a long time ago. And I've done a lot of things since then. I've worked as a software developer in many situations. Software quality and process improvement are two of my other interests. And then for about 25 years, I've been a consultant. So I've had a chance to see what people do in a lot of different kinds of organizations and companies of all sorts and sizes in businesses. And I've learned a lot. That's one nice thing about being a consultant is you get to see what a lot of people are doing. So you can learn from their experience and not just have to do everything yourself. So one lesson I learned, and this I don't think is the most important lesson, but it is quite important, is that you don't have time to make every mistake that every software developer before you has already made. So let's learn from those other people's mistakes so we don't have to climb all those same learning curves. And that's one thing I enjoyed about being a consultant, is to pick a lot of people's brains and hear a lot of interesting stories. But I think the most important lesson I learned is that when we're trying to understand a system or just a problem, is let's not focus so much when we're discussing the solution on the features that a product should have in it, but let's first understand how people will use the product. So in other words, I favor a usage-centric approach to business analysis more than a product or feature-centric approach. And I think that's the most important lesson I've learned. I think that's a better way to meet customer needs in most cases. Not every case. I mean, if you're inventing something brand new no one's ever seen before, you don't have usage information. But most of us aren't working on systems and products like that.
Interesting. So if I'm building a new product, and I know that a lot of people that are probably seeing this video are working on product development, especially these days when the focus changed from project development to product development, you're bringing them a good tip, is that don't look for the product so much, or not, don't focus on the product and forget about the user. And try to understand from the user point of view, how will they use the software? How could that be implemented, this lesson you gave us? How could that be implemented in the day-to-day of a product owner or a business analyst who is working in, let's say, a product development team?
Well, I think the first thing we want to do then is to understand our stakeholders. Okay, if you're taking a usage-centric approach, thinking backwards, that means, well, we need to know who our users are, or at least, a cross-section of them. Now, users are a subset of customers, and customers are a subset of stakeholders. So from a practical point of view, I think a very important thing to do early in any project is to cast a very wide net, looking for potential stakeholders who will supply either requirements or constraints that the system and the product is going to have to address. And then from there, we can drill down and understand who are our different classes of users. People sometimes talk about the user. Well, almost no product has a user or a single monolithic type of users. So we have to identify multiple user classes, and each of these groups of users is going to have largely different sets of requirements. There could be some overlap, of course, but they'll have their own sets of requirements, their own sets of tasks they need to perform. So once we've identified our user classes, we need to find out who will be the literal voice of the customer for each of these groups. And when we started thinking this way, when I was working at Kodak as a software developer back in the middle 1980s, we identified people we called product champions, members of the user communities that we were serving, to work with the BAs to understand requirements. So I think those are important first steps. And then as we work with them, the worst question you can ask, I think, during a requirements discussion is, what are your requirements? Or what do you want? Those are terrible questions. Because people don't know how to answer those questions. And so I think a much better way is to understand how users will interact with the system to accomplish specific tasks. So let's not ask people what they want, or let's not ask people what features they want to see in the system or the product. Let's ask them what they need to do with the product. And so that is a small change in the questions we ask, but I think it's a very big change in the perspective that we take. And I think use cases are a very good way to do that.
I'm listening about what you're saying, and I'm thinking about some techniques I could use. So to understand my users, I probably could use personas as a technique to create different types of users. Right. To understand what they want to do with my product, I could use jobs to be done as a technique to write those requirements from a user's perspective, or to understand how they will deal with my product. I could use the customer journey to see in my business all the connections they have, and to see the usage. As you said, I could use use cases or prototypes as ways to discuss with them how would be that usage from their perspective, and try to create that not just for myself, but with them. And these product champions would be very useful.
Yeah, I think those are all effective techniques to be, thoughtfully applied at the right time with the right group of people. Interesting thing about personas is they are fake people, right? Persona, by definition, is saying, well, we don't really know a person who can tell us what they need, so let's invent a person that's like the kind of user class we're talking about. So it's even better if we can work with real members of the user class, and you can't always. So personas are a good way to try to fill that gap. But one way to start the conversation is to even ask people, okay, let's say you're building an information system. Say, think about a session you would have with this information system. Why would you log into it? Why would you launch this app? What are you trying to accomplish in a session with that app? And that starts focusing the discussion on the things people need to do as opposed to the features. And then from that understanding of what people are trying to accomplish and how they imagine interacting with a system to get to that end result on their journey, then we can, as a business analyst, derive the necessary functionality that has to be implemented to let that happen. And we can start thinking about things like exceptions. What could go wrong? And how do we handle that? And we could start thinking about non-functional requirements like quality attributes, response time, security, privilege levels. All those other kinds of things can come out of those discussions.
Interesting. When you're talking, I think that functional requirements and non-functional requirements, all the solution requirements, they're not coming directly from elicitation. They're coming from analysis from what I elicited. So I should elicit or should bring forward the user needs, and analyzing those needs, I should see that there are different alternatives to fulfill those needs. So a solution is always something that we have to negotiate and think about pros and cons in different alternatives and decide what's the best alternative for that. And after I analyze that, I can decide about functionalities or functional, non-functional requirements or quality of service requirements.
Right. And by focusing on the tasks users are trying to accomplish, you might conclude that, oh, we don't need any software at all. There's other ways to solve that. So a lot of problems go away. Another thing you might learn is, oh, we already have a capability to do that, but we hadn't thought of it that way. So now we can build in an access path I ran into that once on a system I worked on many years ago, where I started getting users coming to me and saying, well, I was trying to do this with it and I was having a problem. And I said, gee, it wasn't designed for people to do that with it. We never even thought of that. But I can see how you could make that work. So let's see if we can make it work easier for you now that we understand that that's something you're doing. So that all gets back to usage. It doesn't deal with the focus on features. And one reason I'm so big on understanding usage patterns as opposed to functions and features. I don't know about you. Have you ever worked on a project where people built some software with certain functionality that no one ever used?
Yes, unfortunately, did.
Isn't that annoying? You put just as much work into trying to implement that functionality well as you did the part that people do use, and people don't use it. So that becomes largely wasted effort. Well, if you focus on understanding what functionality we have to build to let people perform certain tasks that we now understand, then you don't build so much functionality that no one ever uses because it might not align with achieving a task. Another problem we run into sometimes is that sometimes people implement all the functionality that was requested, and yet users still cannot accomplish certain tasks because we didn't think about it from a task perspective. So I think the usage approach solves a lot of those problems.
Perfect. I want to get back to something you said very in the beginning of this session. You told us about learning from the mistake of others. And that seems very wise, that you don't have to fall in the holes that other ones have already fallen, and you can learn from others. And I know that you published recently a very nice book with some pearls or software development pearls, and I want to know a little bit more, or I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about what is in this book.
Okay, well, I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, Software Development Pearls was published just earlier this year in November of 2021. The subtitle is Lessons from 50 Years of Software Experience. So as I said, I've done a lot of software development and related things, but I'm also a user, right? I mean, we're all users and customers as well as being BAs or developers or whatever else we might do in the profession. And so I realized that through all my experiences, and both my personal experiences on projects and observing other people, I did see these patterns start to emerge, which I called out as lessons. And I've got 60 lessons in the book in 6 different categories: requirements, design, project management, teamwork and culture, quality, and process improvement. So I don't talk about coding. There's lots of other books on coding and testing and those kinds of more technical topics. But these other areas are all critical to software success. And some of these are lessons that I learned the hard way by making mistakes and saying, well, that didn't work very well. Maybe I should do something different next time. But as you point out, let's try to learn from other people's mistakes. And that way we don't have to climb all the same learning curves. I really think process improvement in the broad sense is something we should all be concerned about. Have you ever known anyone who could honestly say, I am building software today as well as software could ever be built?
Probably. Just if they're wrong.
Just if they're wrong. Yes, I don't think anybody can say that. So my thinking is, well, if you can't say that, maybe you should be looking for a better way to do whatever it is you do that's part of a project. And so that's what I've got in this book, is I've got a lot of these lessons in these different categories. Most of them, or the largest number, are on requirements, but there are many other topics as well. And from those lessons, I don't just state the lesson, but I also describe a lot of stories about how I've learned this or how I've seen it in action and how I've seen other people doing something that revealed this sort of lesson. And I give you a lot of suggested technical practices, like we were talking about with stakeholder analysis and use cases, those kinds of things. Technical practices that can help you apply that lesson on a project. And so what I've tried to do is give people a lot of ways that they can get ideas of how they could do something better, how they could avoid some of the traps that a lot of us have stepped into before, and climb learning curves quickly rather than slowly and painfully.
That's great. I want to thank you for giving these lessons, for sharing these lessons with all of us. I will leave a link below this video for those who are interested in this book, so they can find more information about it. And I want to thank you again to be here today to chat with us. Thank you, Karl.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure. It's always good to see you.